talking about the rapture, and just not to visit that area too much again, but just to maybe summarize before we leap into something else here today. Remember that we looked at the fact that there are actually, amongst evangelicals who believe in such a thing as a rapture, generally three thoughts about the timing of that rapture: the pre-tribulation rapture, the mid-tribulation rapture, the post-tribulation rapture. If you recall, last week I tried to demonstrate to you biblically that only one of those can actually be so, and that's the pre-tribulation rapture. It's not that there isn't a rapture-like event that happens in the middle. That's when the 144,000, the two witnesses go up. It's not that a rapture-like event doesn't happen at the end. That's when all of those who have given their heads rather than take the mark are raised from the dead. So at the beginning of the tribulation period, the Gentile church and those who are saved in all history that have long since died, they all go up. And then in the middle of the tribulation period, the two witnesses, 144,000, go up. The end, then those that died rather than take the mark of the beast during the tribulation, they get raised from the dead and are then brought into their eternal state. So by the time the tribulation's over, right, you have everybody that's going to be raptured, in a matter of speaking, but really the thing that we call the rapture of the church, that is pre-tribulational. And when you look at all the descriptions that we have of it, and all the descriptions of those various events, when maybe if you think about it, you could say, well, maybe that's when it happens. The only one of those that actually stands up to scrutiny is the pre-tribulation rapture. All right. So that was last week. That brings us to the end of the end of the gap, right? I mean, the rapture is the end of that gap we've been talking about for so long. We've been talking about the gap between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel. And I should probably say this now. I think I have at least once or twice along the line. When we think about eschatology from the totality of scriptures and what it says about that, what everything really comes down to is the vision of the weeks in Daniel chapter 9 is the statement that God made about what was going to happen, what was going to unfold, and why. And everything else that the Bible has to say about eschatology and end times basically has to tie back, or does tie back, into that vision of the weeks. So if we understand the vision of the weeks, we're going to understand eschatology from a biblical standpoint. We're going to understand things like the rapture. We're going to understand what's happening with 144,000 Jews. Those things will fall into place if we have an understanding of the vision of the weeks. It will drive clarity into the rest of our look at eschatology throughout the Bible. So, having said that, we're at the end of the gap between the 69th and 70th week. The 70th week, the thing that marks that out, according to Daniel chapter 9, verse number 27, is that a covenant is signed with a prince for 1/7. And what that prince is the Antichrist. And so the Antichrist, the thing that really initiates that last week, that 70th week, is the Antichrist signing that covenant for 7 years. Now, we can ask, who is he going to sign it with? I think that the assumption has to be, because of the context of Daniel chapter 9, it's about the Jews in Jerusalem. So who would a prince sign a covenant with in that context? He would sign a covenant with the Jews, and probably having something to do with Jerusalem. Now, this is just a little bit ahead, but I'll just kind of lay it out there right now, just if nothing else, because it's an interesting thought. I actually think that probably the chief feature of that covenant, and this is a little speculative, but we'll touch on some of the things as we get into this a little bit deeper. I think one of the cores of this particular covenant is going to be the right of the Jews to rebuild the temple. If you recall, when we were touching on those two witnesses, of course that's found in Revelation chapter 11, but when you get in there, there's a little interlude in visions there in which the temple is being measured, which means that it's going to be there. at that point in time that the vision is speaking of. It certainly seems to be the case in Daniel chapter 11 moving into Daniel chapter 12, because the temple is a big part of what's going on there. There is no temple now. The Romans tore it apart and burned it down, or burned it down and tore it apart in 70 AD. And so it's not there now. There is some question about where the location of that temple actually was. This is also a little speculative, but I think that the best evidence that I've seen says that it was not on the dome of the rock. It was not where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, up on the so-called Temple Mount. That location makes a whole lot more sense archaeologically speaking if it's seen as the Roman fortress that was there in Jerusalem rather than the temple grounds. Now, if you think about it, what that means is right now, right where we are in time, is there anything from a location standpoint that would prevent the Israelites from building a temple on the spot that they were supposed to build the temple? And my answer would be no. There's nothing there. It's wilderness. And it was prophesied to be that in the Old Testament when they talked about, the temple being torn down. The long and short of it, of all of that, is just this is that right now it is possible for the right figure, the right political figure, to enter into a covenant with the Israelites concerning the temple, and there's really nothing that would stop it or hinder it on the ground, which is an interesting thought, is it not? All right. So, all of this talk about the Antichrist means that we should probably look into this guy. And that's what we're going to spend most of tonight doing, probably all of tonight doing, because when you see this slide, we're going to be on this next slide for a long time, you're going to realize that I probably put too many bullet points on one slide. But nonetheless, let's see what we got here. Here we go. Now, at the top of this slide, if you're taking notes, you might want to write some of this down. These are all the various spots in the Scripture where you can find material on the 70th week of Daniel. Some of them, well, of course, will mention it quite directly. Others of it will only be indirect in the sense that events that are described as occurring in the 70th week are described in these other passages. So therefore, they're talking about the same thing. You can see the Daniel chapter 9 passage, that's pretty straightforward and simple, but also in Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12. And then in the Revelation, we have all of these passages in 8, from chapter 8 to chapter 11, from chapter 12 to chapter 16, a bit in chapter 19, and then we have the Olivet Discourse talking about this particular event. Not the whole Olivet Discourse. Remember when we talked about the Olivet Discourse, that's the reason why just most of the commentators of it are absolutely befuddled, is they try to jam like everything, right? They all try to jam everything into the small period of the tribulation, that 7 years. When you do that, all you get is confusion, all you get is conflict. So you've got to understand where in the Olivet Discourse the tribulation period, that 7 years, is actually talked about. Well, here's where it is. It starts with verse number 15 in chapter 24 of Matthew. Goes to verse number 31. Here's the same material for the most part. Slightly different, but the same for the most part in Mark and then in Luke. So you have those three takes, if you will, on the Olivet Discourse, and the part of them that refers to the 70th week is here mentioned. And then we have that space in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and that one is really important. That one's really important mainly because it's the one that undercuts some of the Hal Lindsey or the Tim LaHaye, the late great planet Earth, the Left Behind kind of a viewpoint of what's going to be happening during the tribulation. If you look to those kinds of approaches, you would think that during the tribulation, it's like first shot for the Jews to get things right with God, and second shot for the Gentiles to get things right with God. 2 Thessalonians does not allow an interpretation that would make that possible. Right? That's the one where you leave the Bible in the attic, for your unsaved nephew who's incorrigible, and you figure that once everyone gets zapped out in the rapture, he'll go up to clean up your attic, and open up the Bible and read it, and suddenly realize what's going on and you'll get saved. There's a reason why that's fanciful and speculative and not biblical, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is the reason. Right? 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, maybe I should just describe this so that you're all on the same page with me here. Right? 2 Thessalonians 2 says, because the people at that time did not love the truth, so to be saved, a strong delusion will be sent upon them. And they will bring, and they, all of them, there's no exceptions here, it's talking about all of them will believe a lie. So basically, today is the day of salvation. Today is the day to get right with Christ. Today, it's the light, it's the time when there is light. Darkness is coming when no man can work. And that really is the tribulation period. So it's like, don't ever get shy when it comes to being an evangelist in this day and age, thinking, well, even if I'm too bashful, too shy, too scared to say something to someone about Jesus, I can always leave a tract, one of those chick tracts or something, and they'll see it after we get zapped out of here, and then they'll get saved. No, that's not going to happen. Those that are going to be saved get saved now. They get saved in this age. They get saved before the rapture. After the rapture, the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Right? Romans chapter 11. After the rapture, the full number of Gentiles has come in. And we spent some time on this, right? The full number, what that means. We're talking about something that's finite. Full number of the Gentiles has come in. What's God's business on the earth then? The Jews. Which makes sense, right? Because you're in the 70th week of Daniel. What did Daniel tell us in verse number 24 was the purpose of those 70 weeks? To finish God's work with the Jews. Okay? So the only reason there are that 7 additional years kind of stacked on to the end of time is because of the unfinished work that God promised Daniel to do for the Jews. All right. So that brings us into this period of time called the tribulation period. Daniel's 70th week, sometimes called the Great Tribulation. Any of those titles they describe what's going on just fine. Who is the central figure in that time? It's the Antichrist. So we're going to look at who this fella is. We'll look at, there's actually quite a fair amount of description when you stack it all together like this in the Bible concerning this person. And then, if I'm feeling particularly bold, I might even just name a name or two. Or at least one name by the time we all get done with this. So, having said all that, let's move into this particular slide. What do we know about the Antichrist? Well, the first thing that we know about him is that he is a man. Why is that important? There's been some speculation over the last 20 years, maybe about that amount of time or so, that maybe the beast is referring to something intangible, something mechanistic, like a computer system or things of that nature. No, that cannot be the truth. Why? Because very, very clearly in this particular passage of Scripture, verse number 18 in chapter 13 of the Revelation, it says that the beast is a man. The beast being another symbolic representation in the Revelation for the Antichrist. He is a man. In fact, he's a man with a name. And his name has the gematria value of 666. Now, the thing about that is that there is some debate amongst textual critics, textual scholars, about if that's really the number. Because our very best manuscripts that we have, now, of course, the Bible, we don't have anything that's even close to being something that was written at the time that the Bible was actually written. All of the stuff that we have, what we do have, is fragmented, it's pot-marked, it's faded. Some of it has been written over by other stuff, and special techniques have to be used to get off the stuff that overlies it to get to the things beneath it. We have remarkably old evidence, old manuscript evidence for the Bible, for the New Testament in particular, for the Old Testament as well. but it's not, it's not like you can go to a museum. You can go to a museum and see Gutenberg's Bible, but you can't go to a museum and see Paul's letters. Because there's nothing like that out there. There's just bits and pieces and fragments and everything else. Very old, but that's the way it is. And the very best pieces, and when I say best, the things that the textual scholars think are the oldest and the most reliable of the manuscripts that we have for this portion of Scripture, they say that the number is 616. Okay, which, that's just not nearly as much fun. 666, it just kind of has a certain elan, a certain flair. It's like, it just seems like that would be nicer. But to tell you the truth, there's a little bit of doubt. Now, the bulk of scholarship says it's 666, and that goes back for a long, long period of time that the bulk of scholarship has thought it was 666. But it is possible that it could be 616. Now, what is gematria? The gematria is a game that you can play with certain languages. You can't do it with English. People try to do it with English, but you can't do it with English because English has its own numerical system. We use, it's not really ours. We stole it from the Arabs, but nonetheless, we have our own. We have a separate numerical system for writing down numbers, so you cannot really play this game with English. But you can play with Hebrew, because the Hebrews did not have a separate numerical system. So their letters also were their numbers. So like Aleph is 1, and then they have the Bayat and all the other various letters they have get values 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then getting letters symbolizing bigger numbers than that. Greek, Koine Greek did the same thing. So the New Testament's written in Koine Greek. The Revelation, where this comes from, is written in Koine Greek. That language does have that quality where numbers and letters, well, I should say letters can be letters or numbers in their way of communicating. So context tells you whether you're looking at a number or you're looking at a word. Like if if you're looking at something and it says, send over 15 chickens, right? Now, if you read that as a word, it might say something different, like send me over weird chickens. Well, that doesn't make any sense, especially if you're writing an order. So the context will tell you, it can't mean weird, it's got to mean 15, And that's a totally made-up example. There's, 15 and weird do not mean the same thing in Greek. But you understand what I'm saying by the silliness of the example, if nothing else. You can play that game. So basically what this is telling us is that when this man comes along, when this Antichrist comes along, he's going to have a name. It may be his birth name. It may be his chosen title name. A lot of times when people come into a position of power or leadership or a big change in their life, they change their name. So, how many of you know, if I would ask you who was a very famous Mohandas in history, you'd probably say, I don't know, but that's actually the birth name of Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, his name was actually Mohandas. And that happens a lot even with kings. They have a name, but when they are invested with the crown, then they'll take a regnal name, and their name sometimes changes. That happens with popes, for goodness sake. I don't know what the last pope's name was before he became, what is it now, Francis that we have. Hopefully that was the change. But nonetheless, that happens a lot. So we don't know at this point in time whether we're talking about a birth name, a given name, a legal name, a nickname, a regnal name. We just don't know that yet. I don't know that that'll clarify until we're right on top of that time. And the good news is, we won't be here. So we're talking about something tonight that we're not going to see. But that's all right, because it's in the Bible and it should be interesting, if nothing else, just for that. All right, so that's the Antichrist. First thing we're going to say about him, he is a person, not a machine, not a computer network. It is an actual human being. And the value of his name will be Probably 666, but maybe 616. All right, let's talk about the next thing. Now I'm going to break new ground here, so we're going to do a little bit of reading here. Those of you who've been around enough to hear me teach on this stuff in the past, this is not going to be so new to you. But if you haven't, I'm sure you have never heard this in your entire life. So I'm going to get here to, this is where we're going, Revelation chapter 17. Revelation chapter 17. I'm going to go back up to verse number 9 just for context's sake. This calls for a mind of wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 hills on which a woman sits. Now it's talking about the whore of Babylon, right? They are also 7 kings. Okay, so it's a symbol with a dual purpose. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for a little while. The beast who once was, now is not, is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. Okay, there's some stuff in here that we're going to have to unpack before we can say anything else about this. The first thing I want to say is that this is very commonly, and has been very commonly throughout history, this has been interpreted from a perspective called preterism. Now what preterism believes is that the Revelation was written about things that have already occurred. And so a preterist, when they look at the Revelation, they think that this book was written, most of those folks don't have any belief at all, so they believe it was written after 70 AD. But there are some preterists who still have some faith that God knows how to tell the future. They might date the book in the late 60s. Either of those circumstances really have a hard slog trying to prove it textually. I think that, like the church has virtually for all of its ages, that the Revelation was written in 95 AD. It was written not about events that had already occurred, but it was written as John was reaching the last days of his life. It was written because he was the last one who was still alive, that had been with Jesus, that had traveled with Jesus, that had heard all the things that Jesus taught, who was there when Jesus was crucified, and who witnessed the empty tomb and Jesus alive afterwards. This was the last one alive who saw Jesus go up through the sky. This was John. He's near the end of his life at this point in time, and he's the last remaining witness of all things of import in the New Testament. Does it make sense that God would speak to him a word about how things were going to unfold after that? Well, sure it does, and that's what basically the Revelation is. It's in a matter of speaking a parallel to what Daniel had, particularly when Daniel was getting those visions, like in Daniel chapter 7 of the various beasts, or Daniel chapter 8 when it was about the goat and the sheep, or when you get to Daniel 10 and 11 and 12, and you start moving into more details about how those things played out or would play out in time. What I mean by this is just this. Daniel was exiled in about 605 BC. He was from the elite in Jerusalem. He was a young man of good family. He was a young man of excellent potential and prospects. And he was exiled because of that, taken to the court in Babylon. Daniel was a person in his situation who was, he saw Solomon's temple. He saw Jerusalem in its glory. He saw God's people in the promised land and living there, more or less in, with some degree of peace and prosperity. And then along comes the exile, and away he goes to Babylon. And of course, the question on his mind is am I, is this it? It's just am I the last of the Jews, basically? I mean, when me and my friends go by the wayside, is it over? He was praying because he was reading in the prophet Jeremiah that the captivity was only going to be 70 years, and suddenly he had some hope, and he realized that there might be something left in the tank as far as God and Israel goes. And would there be a better agent than Daniel, being the man that he was, having gone through the experiences that he had? Would there be a better one for God to stop in and say, look, Dan, calm down here, buddy. I want you to know something. I'm not done with the Jews. In fact, I have really good plans for them. Let me tell you what I'm going to do. And then he just wrote it out to the end of time, till he was all finished doing his perfect work with the Jews. See, that's pretty much in my mind, that's how my crazy mind sees what was going on with Daniel. And I see something very similar going on with John. John's, the last one. He's in exile on the Isle of Patmos, which from what I understand, never been there. Were you at Patmos? It's just a big rock for the most part. So, he said he was in the Spirit one Lord's Day. That's when he started hearing the voice in the sound of trumpets and whatnot, and the whole vision of the Revelation came to him. But it makes so much sense, because here he is, having gone through all that he had gone through in life, in ministry, in the work of the gospel, and just being the witness that he was to Christ himself. And boy, all of his companions are gone now. Everybody who shared in what he shared with, they're gone now. What was he thinking on that isle in exile? How's this going to work out? I mean, a lot of very respectable scholars paint the understanding of the early church this way, is that Jesus ascended into the heavens, and they really expected him back in the next several years. I don't know how true that is from what I read in the New Testament. It seems like there was a lot of expectancy built into most of the things that were said there. But nonetheless, let's just take that to be the case. If it was the case, you can maybe get a sense of maybe what John was feeling in that situation. And so what does God do? John, I've got everything under control. You might be the last of the witnesses here on this place, but guess what? I got plans. Everything's going to work out just right. Let me show you something. Let me show you how this is all going to spin itself out. And I just get the sense that that's kind of what was going on with Daniel, kind of what was going on with John, and because of that, we have these two tracks, more or less, of understanding what God is doing in time. Daniel giving us the vision of the weeks as the spine, as the skeleton of understanding everything eschatological. Why? Well, because everything eschatological always boils back down to what? The Jews and Jerusalem. Why is there an end of time? Because God had a plan, and he made a promise that said the Jews would be in the land of promise, Jerusalem, their city of peace, and the Messiah would be reigning there forever. That's the plan of God, right? And so everything, about end times is just the unfolding, the details of God getting that done. And all of us Gentiles, we're just kind of like a little hiccup, if you will, in between the 69th and the 70th week of that plan. And all of this comes back to this tribulation period, back to this particular thing that we're looking at tonight. And I say all that to say this. This has been God's plan from basically the beginning of time. Throughout the scriptures, and in the early parts of our study in this, we visited places in Genesis. Why did we visit those places in Genesis? Well, I wanted you to understand the depth of God's plan for the end of time. That this was not an afterthought on his part. It was not plan B. God wasn't scrambling to try to fix things after we broke them or anything else like that. No, he had an understanding, he had insight, he had vision, he had perspective and knowledge. This is what he wanted to do. This is what he wanted to accomplish. And in having that plan and then piecemeal revealing it to us, guess who else got into it in some respect? The devil. I mean, as God was revealing this plan throughout time, the devil was at least picking up on the things that God was telling us, and who knows what else he might have been privy to as far as, the heavenly realm. We really don't know. We know that, for instance, in the book of Job, the devil used to show up in God's throne room to give report to him. So we really don't know how much of God's plan the devil actually was privy to, even apart from those bits and pieces that God inspired prophets to give to us. Regardless, one way or the other, right, the devil has had some understanding of what was in God's mind, where God was going with this. And that being the case, what do you think that the devil's motivation has been throughout all this time? Knowing how he hates God, and knowing how he hates us. His plan has been to try to thwart it. So the devil has been working his deals throughout history with this one aim. He wants to undermine God's plan to bring the Messiah reigning in Jerusalem, over a people over the world, but over in the environs of Jerusalem, the place for the children of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. Now, the devil has been just absolutely hell-bent at destroying that plan. It's why the devil, through history, has inspired such hatred for the Jewish people. God's not inspiring that hatred. That's the devil's doing. And he's doing it because he wants to undermine the promises that God has made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the thing about it is, if he manages to do that, see, he undermines us too. Because we are not standing on some isolated, insulated, prophetic blessing given to us as Gentiles. We are people that are being grafted into. We are being plugged into the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay? And so the devil has had a plan throughout all history to undermine the Jewish people, because in doing that, he undermines the promise made to Abraham. He undermines the ability for people to trust the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what he can do instead, if they have that doubt, is he can put a shill in the place of the Messiah and basically get humanity to worship him instead of God. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that clearly enough? That's the devil's plan. It's been his plan throughout all history. Why is that important to this spot? Well, there has been a series of 7 historic periods of time in which this plan has been launched in a serious way by the devil. If you go back to history, you'll find 7 kingdoms that came this close to wiping out the Jewish people and thereby wiping out the promise. The first of those was Egypt. Egypt was dead set in its mind at the time when it came to keep the Jews in Egypt, to keep them out of the land that was promised. If that would happen, if that would have been successful, what would that have meant to the promise to Abraham? It would have nullified it. If we can nullify a promise of God, we nullify God. That the devil wanted to do. So what was the devil's plan at that time in Egypt? To keep the Israelites there. Right? Now, God had other plans, and they came out. And then we went to another kingdom. This time, it was the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians were people that came from the north area of Mesopotamia, up there just to the west and southwest, and even to the northwest of Lake Van, that area. They were one of the earliest great empires in the world, and in particular in the Middle East. And they were a particularly violent and almost spiteful in their use of violence people. They just did awful things. In fact, a lot of the awful things that got done by other people that came after them, they learned from the Assyrians. But they were terrible, terrible people. They had, again, the devil stirring things up, brought them into the Holy Lands, into the land of Canaan, to do one thing, to destroy Israel, to kick them out of the land, to kill them off, to exterminate them. And they were pretty successful. I mean, they wiped out Samaria. They wiped out the northern kingdom. That's the lost 10 tribes that we often talk about. They were heading into Judah to finish that off. Judah had a good king at that time, right? King Hezekiah was there. But they went in, laid siege to Jerusalem, destroyed a bunch of other fortified cities in Judah, and it looked like it was the last days for the Jewish people. And it would have been the last days for the Jewish people. That's why we call them the lost 10 tribes. We have no idea what happened to them, where they went, how they got assimilated. They're just lost to us. God knows where they are, but we don't. We have no idea. History does not know anything about them. That would have been the case for all of Israel if this humongous army that the Assyrians came into Judah would have been successful. But what happened? Well, Hezekiah prayed, which is always a good thing. But what happened is God intervened. And the Israelites went out and they found 180,000 man army dead and gone. One night, one fell swoop, God wiped out the threat. So ended that particular scheme. Right? So you see where we're going with this. That's 2 kingdoms. Then we have Babylon. Then we have Persia. Persia is a bit of a problem, right? Because when you talk about Persia, you have Cyrus the Great when he came into power, when he defeated the Babylonians, right? He signed almost immediately, not quite immediately, but really quickly, he signed a decree allowing the Jews to go back home to reestablish themselves in the Holy Land. So he seems like a good guy. And he was prophesied to be a good guy by Jeremiah and Isaiah and others. So it's hard to understand the Persians as being part of these schemes. And I always thought that way. And it made me scratch my head. One of the things that also made me scratch my head is I never could understand the book of Esther. For the life of me. I mean, I read it because it's in the Bible, and I don't trust my mind to be the thing that tells God what's what. Right? Even if my mind is saying, that book is so stupid, it doesn't even mention the name of God. Now, how could old people back in the ancient times have thought that that was inspired by God? You know, that's what my human mind was thinking. But see, the Spirit that God has given me says, no. No. Jesus knew that was Scripture, so that means that it is Scripture. And so I just had to live with this battle inside my mind, not knowing what to do with the book of Esther. And then one day, it was one of those days when I was just, reading around in the Revelation, and it dawned on me that this scheme here made perfect sense from the incident with Haman. Now, if you remember Haman, he was like the vizier of the Persian Empire. He was second to the emperor, and he didn't like the Jews. And he came up with a scheme to wipe them out. And it looked like he was going to succeed. I mean, they had a provision that he tricked the emperor into making a law. If a law was made by the emperor and signed, it couldn't be changed. So it looked like things were put into place in a way that couldn't be overturned. The Jews were going to, in one day, find themselves wiped out. God intervened through Esther. Right? I mean, I never understood that story until the understanding of this thing right here started coming to into my heart and mind. Suddenly it's like, that's why it's there. That's another king in the series, right? And so we go through there. We get to the place eventually, right? You got Greeks in there, you got Romans in there, but eventually we get to the place, and this is where I want to jump to right now, where, biblically speaking, this figure doesn't exist. He says 5 have come, one more is to come. So at the time that this was written in 95 AD, 5 were historic, I've mentioned them at least, even though I didn't talk about all of them. Right? 5 are historic. The 6th one, or the 7th one, that would have been the Romans. Right? So you have 5 that were in the past in 95 AD, 1 that would be the Romans. Why were the Romans part of that? We talked about this a lot of times, right? This was the Hadrian and Trajan, their decrees that sent the Jewish people into the diaspora. So by 135 AD, under Roman law, it was no longer allowable for a Jew to be in Jerusalem or in the virus of Jerusalem, which meant basically out of the Holy Land. So that's why there's Jews scattered all over the place, because the Romans kicked them out of the Holy Lands. Right? That was number 6. Then 7 would be future for them. Now you have to go from the Romans the whole way up to our age, right? Think about historically. Has there been a king who came to power who had one thing in mind, and that was to destroy the Jews? It was Hitler. And great description of him right there in Revelation. It says he won't be around long. Hitler came to power in 1933, declaring a 1,000-year Reich. He committed suicide in April of 1945. So he was not really around all that long, was he? Good description there in the Revelation. So who was the 7th king? It was Hitler. So in this scheme of kings, we've looked at 7, and the 8th one, we are told in the passage, is the beast. Now it makes a whole lot of sense if you think about what's happened since Hitler. 1948, the Jews claimed their own nation, the Jewish state in Israel. 1967, the Jews take over control of the city of Jerusalem. 2017, the United States under Donald Trump declares what? Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the state of Israel. I don't know if Donald Trump didn't do anything else good, that was really good. Anyhow, the long and short of that is that since the time that Hitler has come and gone off the scene, things in this part of the world that we're interested in here have really started doing amazing things to fall into place to bring this prophetic picture into view. And one of these things that we are waiting on now is this 8th guy, the Antichrist, to come and sign this covenant with the Jews, which I said already, I think is probably going to have as probably one of its main points, the right of the Israelites to build a temple. The 8 kings are not the Roman empires, and this is what the preterists say, right? They'll give you a succession of Roman emperors to try to get you to the destruction of Jerusalem and try to fit it into this scenario. And to some degree they can pull off some of that, except that they have to move the writing of the Revelation about 30 years ahead of what it actually was in order to get the 5 were, 1 is to come. If they don't do that, then what they have to do is they have to say that this book was not truly written prophetically, that it was written after the fact in the form of, or in the genre of, an apocalypse. Don't ever go to that place. Don't ever mess with the Word of God. Don't ever try to call it something other than that which is God-breathed. When you start making human beings the one who are in charge of determining, for instance, whether something was actually written before time or was after time just to fool us, you are destroying the basis for any belief in God whatsoever. Right? So to me, when people have those kinds of interpretations of these matters, they are undermining the faith that they think that in some sense they're trying to prop up. You know, God doesn't need crutches. He doesn't need us to make them for Him. He doesn't need us to stand up and fight for him, although, I mean, sometimes we have to stand up for him. The fact of the matter is, God knows how to take care of himself, right? And what God has said, he has said. And it will prove itself in time. We don't have to get nervous about that. We don't have to start panicking that somehow or another it might not be, quite that way, or, maybe further evidence of it. Now, God's word's always going to be